Hi students, here is narration 2. Now this is a continuation. So the first narration went from slides 1 to 12, so I'm starting at slide 13, although for recording this will now seem as slide 1. But in the original batch of slides, this is slide 13, and what we're going to look at here is more the structure of the brain. So nothing to do with the peripheral nervous system, the structure of the brain and the different parts, and associate some function with them. Again, we're not going into great detail, just an overview. So this image shows the cerebrum, the brain, a brain removed during an autopsy. And the focus here is on two terms, gray matter and white matter. And so you can see in the cutaway, you're seeing white matter. Let me grab a pen here. So this is showing white matter here. And so white matter looks white because white matter is the myelinated axons, because remember, myelin is lipid, fatty substance, and just as how fat sort of looks white, in animals, when you're cooking chicken or whatever, the fat looks kind of white. Same idea here. And so in terms of location, the surface and the first few inches of the cerebrum will be made up of gray matter. And beneath the gray matter is usually where we find white matter. So gray matter makes up the outer cortex, and cortex is a word that is not peculiar to the brain. You'll find it showing up in other discussions for the other organ systems. Cortex comes from the word that means bark, like the bark of a tree. So it's always the outer part. So cortex always refers to the outer part of a structure, and medulla usually refers to the middle. We don't have a medulla here in the brain in this view. So all we have is gray matter making up the outer cortex, and white matter is found within. So gray matter is then cell bodies. So if you think about it, it's as if for all the neurons, the cell bodies are in the sort of outer portion, and then the axons are extending on the inside of the brain. That's really what the location of gray matter and white matter is meant to tell you. The next slide, we have a different view now of the brain. So we're going to learn a few more things about the brain. Now, the cerebrum is a large component of the central nervous system in humans. And the most obvious aspect of the cerebral cortex is its outer folded surface. So these folds are referred to as gyri, singular gyrus, and they have grooves. The grooves are referred to as sulcus, singular, sulci, plural. If they're very deep grooves, then they're referred to as a fissure. So here we see a longitudinal fissure, and it seems to be going roughly, as if it's going to divide the cerebrum in half. And it's actually in the middle, and what we can't really see, which is why these dotted lines are shown on this diagram. So you would have to look at the sagittal section of a brain to be able to see this. But the brain has two hemispheres, a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, and these two are connected by a structure called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum actually are tracts of nerves. So remember, nerves are bundles of neurons, and they allow the right side of the brain to talk to the left side of the brain. There is specialization in the brain, what is referred to as hemisphere specialization. where certain types of activities seem to occur predominantly in the left or predominantly in the right. You might have heard people allude to the fact that, for example, scientists, engineers tend to be more left brain. There's an element of truth to that statement, but we all use both sides, both hemispheres of our brain daily. And despite the fact that someone might be a scientist or an engineer, many people have very creative outlets. So creativity tends to be more with the right. Now, here's a term which I sort of warned you when I did the first narration to pay attention to the words division, regions, lobes. So here the word lobes is now appearing. And the lobes of the cerebral cortex, you actually already know where they are if you can remember the names of the bones of the skull. So here we go. We have a frontal lobe because this part of the cerebral cortex is covered by the frontal bone. We have a parietal lobe, we have an occipital lobe, and we have a temporal lobe. And separating these lobes, you can see, is a groove which is named the lateral sulcus. You are not responsible for the names of all the different sulci that appear. There's one important one that you ought to know because it will help you to understand the information better, and it's this one right here, which divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Because two very important structures appear right here. This one is labeled the precentral gyrus, and over here it's labeled the postcentral gyrus on this side. And we'll give names to those in a minute. So the cerebral cortex is divided into the four lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Extensive folding increases the surface area available for cerebral functions. So the cerebrum is actually folded to fit inside the skull. And if you unfold it, it would be about the size of a pillow. So again, having a large surface area to a small volume, something called large surface area to volume ratio. Once you have a high surface area, but the volume is small, that's actually a good thing, because it leads to more efficiency with which functions can be performed by a structure, but the structure only takes up a small space in the body, not a lot of space. Now, beneath here, this thing that often looks like a cauliflower, right there, that is a structure called the cerebellum. So cerebellum means little brain, and it helps the body in terms of balance and posture. So all the skeletal muscles send information to the cerebellum. It helps us to know where our limbs are, or the position of our limbs in space. If you are walking and stub your toe and you kind of didn't fall because you were able to right yourself, and stand up straight, that was due to your cerebellum primarily. So the balancing part is very important. It allows us to execute very smooth movements. Think of a ballet dancer, for example, or figure skaters, and helps us to maintain posture throughout the day. Now, the functions of the lobes. So what we'll do is simply ascribe functions to the lobe. There was someone in 1909 who helped. There's been an awful lot of research with regards to our brain, and it's still continuing. So I'll move to the next slide. And so what we want to know is the primary cortex areas are where sensory information is initially detected and processed. So where is the primary cortex area? So the way I like to teach this is I like to make it very clear to students that this area that is colored in green here is the primary motor cortex. So when you hear motor in the nervous system, think of movement. This area here specific parts of this area here send information to skeletal muscles, muscles of the lips, muscles of the arms, etc. And you have to pay attention to the words to and from, sending information versus receiving information when you're learning about the nervous system. So this part, the primary motor cortex, sends information to skeletal muscles to help us execute movement. So you can say it issues commands to skeletal muscles. And these are the skeletal muscles that you were learning that are in different parts of the body. So all along this area here, one part would be allocated, let's say, for the toes, another part for the thighs, and so forth. So that's the primary motor cortex. Now you might want to know what is a motor association area. Association areas are adjacent to primary areas and further processing to make sense of the input occurs. The association areas allow you to kind of make judgment. So in terms of sending information to skeletal muscle, the information needs to go, let's say you want to reach something on a shelf. Well, how high should you have to move your hand? Is it just a little bit above your head, or do you have to really extend your arm? That sort of information is what we're talking about. For now, you can sort of ignore the frontal eye field. That's not pertinent to our discussion. Here is where we have a sulcus dividing the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And this area in red is where we find the primary somatosensory cortex. That's a fancy word. What does it mean? This area receives all of the information regarding sensation. So sensation, in other words, have you touched something that is cool, for example? Did you put on a garment, but it now feels kind of itchy? That sort of thing. So those are sensations. And this is the area that receives that information. And again, it has an association area because that is what helps you to interpret the information. Now, speech is a very important characteristic of humans, and there's a significant amount of cortical area in the brain that is allocated to speech. And speech is divided into sort of two types and two areas. So one area is called Broca's area. Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, so it's here, but Broca's area is responsible for the production of speech. So moving your lips, moving your tongue to say words correctly. So for example, you would need to say fish with the sh sound at the end, as opposed to saying the word fis. So proper pronunciation, and it really has to do with the ability to speak clearly, and also using proper grammar. Now the other area for speech is this one here, Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is found where the temporal and parietal lobes intersect, but it's primarily responsible for understanding spoken and written language. It can also add grammatical refinements to your speech. And the occipital lobe has all to do with vision. So think of how important our eyes are in terms of our daily function. We take it for granted, But close your eyes and imagine that you could not see. How much of what you know about the world is dependent on the fact that you actually have vision? So we take in a lot of information about our safety with our eyes. And all of that information, we're always processing that information, even if we're not consciously aware of it. So the occipital lobe is the primary visual center where the information related to vision, so from our eyes, basically arrives. It has an association area again. So for example, you may be walking down the street, you see someone and you think, oh, that looks like my neighbor. But you're not 100% sure. So what is going on in your brain is the visual association area has memories of this person's face, what they look like, and it is helping you compare what you're seeing now with what is stored in memory so that you can arrive at a decision. And lastly, we have the temporal lobe processes taste and hearing, audition, auditory information. This one is easy to remember because the temporal lobe is, approximately where our ear would be, and that's where our auditory information would be processed. So that's the lobes and their respective functions. An important point that is shown in this, what may look like a sort of cartoon, is the fact that not every body part, so if you think of the size of the human body, not every body part is allocated the same amount of brain tissue to, let's say, control it. Some body parts, especially the limbs and the fingers, the face, the tongue, the lips, etc., those parts involved in speech, they actually have more brain tissue allocated to them for the processing of information. So that's what this slide is meant to tell you. So the cerebrum was one division of the brain. The second division is a structure called the diencephalon. And the diencephalon actually has several parts, and you can only see the diencephalon in a sagittal section of the brain, like this image that's being shown to you here. So the diencephalon is composed primarily of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, you certainly want to pay a lot of attention to it because it will be discussed here. It will be discussed also in the endocrine system. It is a structure that connects the two organ systems. The hypothalamus plays a significant role in homeostasis. It controls water balance, for example. It has what are called osmoreceptors that detect the amount of water and salt present in the body. And the hypothalamus is inferior and anterior to the thalamus. So usually you can locate the pituitary gland, which is an endocrine gland, and that has a significant relationship with the hypothalamus. And then you can see the hypothalamus there, and then we have the thalamus right here. So hypo always means below or beneath, and that's why we have a thalamus and then we have a hypothalamus. Now the thalamus acts as the body's relay station. I think of it as a gatekeeper because information from the arms, legs, from the body has to travel up to the brain. And so it comes up the spinal cord and needs to get up to the brain. Well, before it can be sent to the correct part of the brain for interpretation, that it has to pass through the thalamus. So the thalamus is like a relay station or a gatekeeper, And so sensory information is then sent to the corresponding area of the cerebral cortex for interpretation. The only information that bypasses this system is smell. So the hypothalamus then makes many hormones. So this is the part where we will discuss it a little bit more in the endocrine system. And so it's an endocrine gland, but it also controls our body temperature, for example. So it controls our body temperature, it helps with water balance regulation, and it makes hormones, which are significant in the sense that the hormones, I'm just going to erase this a little bit. The hormones made by the hypothalamus control this gland called the anterior pituitary, the pituitary gland there. So that's the diencephalon. Then we have the brain stem. So just like, the stem in a plant attaches the leaves to sort of the trunk of the tree, the plant. Similarly, we have a brain stem. And so the brain stem attaches the spinal cord to the cerebrum. So in color here, we can see the brain stem, and that little bulge there, is significant. So the order of the structures making up the brain stem is important. We have a structure called the medulla oblongata, which is most inferior in location. It regulates the heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, swallowing. It has these reflexes, etc. So it's very, very important. Next, we have the pons. The pons is the part that is, pons means bridge, and it's the part that bulges outwards. That assists with breathing. So these are centers that help to regulate. Both the pons and the medulla oblongata have a role to play in breathing and keeping our respiratory rate sort of normal. And then we have a structure called the midbrain, which we won't say much more about. Next, we get to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is situated on the posterior surface of the brain stem, immediately posterior to the pons. So it's a structure that looks like a cauliflower. If you get a chance to see a model of the brain, it's worth really looking at. But the cerebellum helps the body adjust to positions in space. The word for knowing where your limbs are in space is called proprioception. So it helps with maintaining equilibrium, graceful movements, and balance. And that's the end of this narration. So I hope that was short and sweet. And you can review, answer these questions here, and then you can check in your answers with me, when we have a meeting. Take care.